Chapter 7 The Story of John Powles. On the 4th of April, 1860, there died in India a young officer in the 12th Regiment MNI, of the name of John Powles. He was an intimate friend of my first husband for several years before his death, and had consequently become intimate with me. Indeed, on several occasions he shared our house and lived with us on the terms of a brother. I was very young at that time and susceptible to influence of all sorts, extremely nervous, moreover, on the subject of ghosts, and yet burning with curiosity to learn something of the other world, a topic which it is most difficult to induce anybody to discuss with you. People will talk of dress, or dinner, or their friends' private affairs, of anything, in fact, sooner than death and immortality and the world to come which we must all inevitably enter. Even parsons, the legalized exponents of what lies beyond the grave, are no exceptions to the rule. When the bereaved sufferer goes to them for comfort, they shake their heads and hope and trust, and say God's mercy has no limits, but they cannot give him one reasonable proof to rest upon that death is but a name. John Powles, however, though a careless and irreligious man, liked to discuss the unseen. We talked continually on the subject, even when he was apparently in perfect health, and he often ended our conversation by assuring me that should he die first, and he always prophesied truly that he should not reach the age of 30, he would, were such a thing possible, come back to me. I used to laugh at the absurdity of the idea, and remind him how many friends had made the same promise to each other and never fulfilled it. For though I firmly believed that such things had been, I could not realize that they would ever happen to me, or that I should survive the shock if they did. John Powles' death at the last was very sudden, although the disease he died of was of long standing. He had been under the doctor's hands for a few days when he took an unexpected turn for the worse, and my husband and myself, with other friends, were summoned to his bedside to say goodbye to him. When I entered the room he said to me,
"So you see it has come at last. Don't forget what I said to you about it."
They were his last intelligible words to me, though for several hours he grasped my dress with his hand to prevent my leaving him, and became violent and unmanageable if I attempted to quit his side. During this time, in the intervals of his delirium, he kept on entreating me to sing a certain old ballad, which had always been a great favourite with him, entitled Thou Art Gone From My Gaze. I am sure if I sung that song once during that miserable day, I must have sung it a dozen times. At last our poor friend fell into convulsions which recurred with little intermission until his death, which took place the same evening. His death and the manner of it caused me a great shock. He had been a true friend to my husband and myself for years, and we both mourned his loss very sincerely. That, and other troubles combined, had a serious effect upon my health, and the doctors advised my immediate return to England. When an officer dies in India, it is the custom to sell all his minor effects by auction. Before this took place, my husband asked me if there was anything belonging to John Powles that I should like to keep in remembrance of him. The choice I made was a curious one. He had possessed a dark green silk necktie, which was a favourite of his, and when it became soiled I offered to turn it for him, when it looked as good as new. Whereupon he had worn it so long that it was twice as dirty as before, so I turned it for him the second time, much to the amusement of the regiment. When I was asked to choose a keepsake of him, I said, "Give me the green tie," and I brought it to England with me. The voyage home was a terrible affair. I was suffering mentally and physically, to such a degree that I cannot think of the time without a shudder. John Powles' death, of course, added to my distress, and during the many months that occupied a voyage by long sea, I hoped and expected that his spirit would appear to me. With the very strong belief in the possibility of the return to earth of the departed, or rather, I should say, with my strong belief in my belief, I lay awake night after night, thinking to see my lost friend, who had so often promised to come back to me. I even cried aloud to him to appear and tell me where he was, or what he was doing, but I never heard or saw a single thing. There was silence on every side of me. 10 days only after I landed in England I was delivered of a daughter, and when I had somewhat recovered my health and spirits, when I had lost the physical weakness and nervous excitability, to which most medical men would have attributed any mysterious sights or sounds I might have experienced before, then I commenced to know and to feel that John Powles was with me again. I did not see him, but I felt his presence. I used to lie awake at night, trembling under the consciousness that he was sitting at my bedside, and I had no means of penetrating the silence between us. Often I entreated him to speak, but when a low, hissing sound came close to my ear, I would scream with terror and rush from my room. All my desire to see or communicate with my lost friend had deserted me. The very idea was a terror. I was horror-struck to think he had returned, and I would neither sleep alone nor remain alone. I was advised to try a livelier place than Winchester, where I then resided, and a house was taken for me at Sydenham. But there, the sense of the presence of John Powles was as keen as before, and so, at intervals, I continued to feel it for the space of several years until, indeed, I became an inquirer into spiritualism as a science. I have related in the chapter that contains an account of my first séance, that the only face I recognized as belonging to me was that of my friend John Powles, and how excited I became on seeing it. It was that recognition that brought back all my old longing and curiosity to communicate with the inhabitants of the unseen world. As soon as I commenced investigations in my home circle, John Powles was the very first spirit who spoke to me through the table, and from that time until the present I have never ceased to hold communion with him. He is very shy, however, as he was, whilst with us, of conversing before strangers, and seldom intimates his presence except I am alone. At such times, however, he will talk by the hour of all such topics as interested him during his earth life. Soon after it became generally known that I was attending séances, I was introduced to Miss Showers, the daughter of General Showers of the Bombay Army. This young lady, besides being little more than a child, I think she was about 16 when we met, was not a professional medium. The séances to which her friends were invited to witness the extraordinary manifestations that took place in her presence were strictly private. They offered therefore an enormous advantage to investigators, as the occurrences were all above suspicion, whilst Miss Showers was good enough to allow herself to be tested in every possible way. I shall have occasion to refer more particularly to Miss Showers' mediumship further on. At present, therefore, I will confine myself to those occasions which afforded proofs of John Powles' presence. Mrs. and Miss Showers were living in apartments when I visited them, and there was no means nor opportunity of deceiving their friends, even had they had any object in doing so. I must add also, that they knew nothing of my Indian life nor experiences, which were things of the past long before I met them. At the first sitting Miss Showers gave me for spirit faces, she merely sat on a chair behind the window curtains, which were pinned together halfway up, so as to leave a V-shaped opening at the top. The voice of Peter, Miss Showers' principal control, kept talking to us and the medium from behind the curtains all the time, and making remarks on the faces as they appeared at the opening. Presently he said to me,
"Mrs. Rawchurch, here's a fellow says his name is Powles, and he wants to speak to you, only he doesn't like to show himself because he's not a bit like what he used to be."
"Tell him not to mind that," I answered. "I shall know him under any circumstances."
"Well, if he was anything like that, he was a beauty,"
exclaimed Peter, and presently a face appeared which I could not, by any stretch of imagination, decide to resemble in the slightest degree my old friend. It was hard, stiff and unlifelike. After it had disappeared, Peter said,
"Powles says if you'll come and sit with Rosie Miss Showers often, he'll look quite like himself by and by."
And of course I was only too anxious to accept the invitation. As I was setting out another evening to sit with Miss Showers, the thought suddenly occurred to me to put the green necktie in my pocket. My 2 daughters accompanied me on that occasion, but I said nothing to them about the necktie. As soon as we had commenced, however, Peter called out,
"Now, Mrs. Rawchurch, hand over that necktie. Powles is coming."
"What necktie?" I asked, and he answered,
"Why, Powles' necktie, of course, that you've got in your pocket. He wants you to put it round his neck."
The assembled party looked at me inquisitively as I produced the tie. The face of John Powles appeared, very different from the time before, as he had his own features and complexion, but his hair and beard, which were auburn during life, appeared phosphoric, as though made of living fire. I mounted on a chair and tied the necktie round his throat, and asked him if he would kiss me. He shook his head. Peter called out,
"Give him your hand."
I did so, and as he kissed it, his moustaches burned me. I cannot account for it. I can only relate the fact. After which he disappeared with the necktie, which I have never seen since, though we searched the little room for it thoroughly. The next thing I have to relate about John Powles is so startling that I dread the criticism it will evoke, but if I had not startling stories to tell, I should not consider them worth writing down. I left my house in Bayswater one Sunday evening to dine with Mr. and Mrs. George Neville in Regent's Park Terrace, to have a séance afterwards with Miss Showers. There was a large company present, and I was placed next to Miss Showers at table. During dinner she told me complainingly that her mother had gone to Norwood to spend the night, and she, Rosie, was afraid of sleeping alone, as the spirits worried her so. In a moment it flashed across me to ask her to return to Bayswater and sleep with me, for I was most desirous of testing her powers when we were alone together. Miss Showers accepted my invitation, and we arranged that she should go home with me. After dinner, the guests sat for a séance, but to everybody's surprise and disappointment, nothing occurred. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when Miss Showers and I entered a cab to return to Bayswater. We had hardly started when we were greeted with a loud peal of laughter close to our ears.
"What's the matter, Peter?"
demanded Miss Showers.
I can't help laughing.
He replied.
To think of their faces when no one appeared. Did you suppose I was going to let you waste all your power with them, when I knew I was going home with you and Mrs. Rawchurch? I mean to show you what a real good séance is tonight.
When we reached home I let myself in with a latchkey. The house was full, for I had 7 children, for servants, and a married sister staying with me, but they were all in bed and asleep. It was cold weather, and when I took Miss Showers into my bedroom a fire was burning in the grate. My sister was occupying a room which opened into mine, but I locked her door on my own, and put the keys under my pillow. Miss Showers and I then undressed and got into bed. When we had extinguished the gas, we found the room was, comparatively speaking, light, for I had stirred the fire into a blaze, and a street lamp just opposite the window threw bars of light through the Venetian blinds, right across the ceiling. As soon as Miss Showers had settled herself in bed, she said,
"I wonder what Peter is going to do."
Here I am, my dear, close to you.
I turned my head, and there stood a dark figure beside the bed, whilst another could be plainly distinguished walking about the room. I said, "I can't see your face," and he replied,
I'll come nearer to you.
Upon this the figure rose in the air until it hung suspended, face downward, over the bed. In this position it looked like a huge bat with outspread wings. It was still indistinct, except as to substance, but Peter said we had exhausted all the phosphorus in our bodies by the long evening we had spent, and left him nothing to light himself up with. After a while he lowered himself onto the bed, and lay between Miss Showers and myself on the outside of the duvet. To this we greatly objected, as he was very heavy and took up a great deal of room, but it was some time before he would go away. During this manifestation, the other spirit, whom Peter called the Pope, kept walking about and touching everything in the room, which was full of ornaments, and Peter called out several times,
Take care, Pope. Take care. Don't break Mrs. Rawchurch's things.
Florence. Whom have you there? You will wake the whole house.
When I replied, "Never mind, it's only spirits," she gave one fell shriek and dived under her bedclothes. She maintains to this day that she fully believed the steps and voices to be human. At last the manifestations became so rapid, as many as 8 and 10 hands touching us at once, that I asked Miss Showers if she would mind my tying hers together. She was very amiable and consented willingly. I therefore got out of bed again, and having securely fastened her hands in the sleeves of the nightdress she wore, I sewed them with needle and thread to the mattress. Miss Showers then said she felt sleepy, and with her back to me, a position she was obliged to maintain on account of her hands being sewn down, she apparently dropped off to sleep, though I knew subsequently she was in a trance. For some time afterwards nothing occurred, the figures had disappeared, the voices ceased, and I thought the séance was over. Presently, however, I felt a hand laid on my head and the fingers began to gently stroke and pull the short curls upon my forehead. I whispered, "Who is this?" and the answer came back.
Don't you know me? I am Powles. At last, after a silence of 10 years, I see you and speak with you again, face to face.
"How can I tell this is your hand?" I said. Peter might be materializing a hand in order to deceive me. The hand immediately left my head and the back of it passed over my mouth, when I felt it was covered with short hair. I then remembered how hairy John Powles' hands had become from exposure to the Indian sun whilst shooting, and how I had nicknamed him Esau in consequence. I recollected also that he had dislocated the left wrist with a cricket ball. "Let me feel your wrist," I said, and my hand was at once placed on the enlarged bone. "I want to trace your hand to where it springs from," I next suggested, and on receiving permission I felt from the fingers and wrist to the elbow and shoulder, where it terminated in the middle of Miss Shower's back. Still I was not quite satisfied, for I used to find it very hard to believe in the identity of a person I had cared for. I was so terribly afraid of being deceived. "I want to see your face," I continued.
I cannot show you my face tonight.
The voice replied. "But you shall feel it." And the face, with beard and moustaches, was laid for a moment against my own. Then the hand was replaced on my hair, and whilst it kept on pulling and stroking my curls, John Powles' own voice spoke to me of everything that had occurred of importance when he and I were friends on earth. Fancy, two people who were intimately associated for years, meeting alone after a long and painful separation. Think of all the private things they would talk about together, and you will understand why I cannot write down the conversation that took place between us that night here. In order to convince me of his identity, John Powles spoke of all the troubles I had passed through and was then enduring. He mentioned scenes, both sad and merry, which we had witnessed together. He recalled incidents which had slipped my memory, and named places and people known only to ourselves. Had I been a disbeliever in spiritualism, that night must have made a convert of me. Whilst the voice, in the well-remembered tones of my old friend, was speaking, and his hand wandered through my hair, Miss Showers continued to sleep, or to appear to sleep, with her back towards me, and her hands sewn into her nightdress sleeves, and the sleeves sewn down to the bed. But had she been wide awake and with both hands free, she could not have spoken to me in John Powles' unforgotten voice of things that had occurred when she was an infant and thousands of miles away. And I affirm that the voice spoke to me of things that no one but John Powles could possibly have known. He did not fail to remind me of the promise he had made, and the many times he had tried to fulfill it before, and he assured me he should be constantly with me from that time. It was daylight before the voice ceased speaking, and then both Miss Showers and I were so exhausted, we could hardly raise our heads from the pillows. I must not forget to add that when we did open our eyes again upon this workaday world, we found there was hardly an article in the room that had not changed places. The pictures were all turned with their faces to the wall, the crockery from the wash-stand was piled in the fender, the ornaments from the mantelpiece were on the dressing table. In fact, the whole room was topsy-turvy. "But you shall feel it." And the face, with beard and moustaches, was laid for a moment against my own. Then the hand was replaced on my hair, and whilst it kept on pulling and stroking my curls, John Powles' own voice spoke to me of everything that had occurred of importance when he and I were friends on earth. Fancy, two people who were intimately associated for years, meeting alone after a long and painful separation. Think of all the private things they would talk about together, and you will understand why I cannot write down the conversation that took place between us that night here. In order to convince me of his identity, John Powles spoke of all the troubles I had passed through and was then enduring. He mentioned scenes, both sad and merry, which we had witnessed together. He recalled incidents which had slipped my memory, and named places and people known only to ourselves. Had I been a disbeliever in spiritualism, that night must have made a convert of me. Whilst the voice, in the well-remembered tones of my old friend, was speaking, and his hand wandered through my hair, Miss Showers continued to sleep, or to appear to sleep, with her back towards me, and her hands sewn into her nightdress sleeves, and the sleeves sewn down to the bed. But had she been wide awake and with both hands free, she could not have spoken to me in John Powles' unforgotten voice of things that had occurred when she was an infant and thousands of miles away. And I affirm that the voice spoke to me of things that no one but John Powles could possibly have known. He did not fail to remind me of the promise he had made, and the many times he had tried to fulfill it before, and he assured me he should be constantly with me from that time. It was daylight before the voice ceased speaking, and then both Miss Showers and I were so exhausted, we could hardly raise our heads from the pillows. I must not forget to add that when we did open our eyes again upon this workaday world, we found there was hardly an article in the room that had not changed places. The pictures were all turned with their faces to the wall, the crockery from the wash-stand was piled in the fender, the ornaments from the mantelpiece were on the dressing table. In fact, the whole room was topsy-turvy. When Mr. William Fletcher gave his first lecture in England, in the Steinway Hall, my husband, Colonel Lean, and I went to hear him. We had never seen Mr. Fletcher before, nor any of his family, nor did he know we were amongst the audience. Our first view of him was when he stepped upon the platform, and we were seated quite in the body of the hall, which was full. It was Mr. Fletcher's custom, after his lecture was concluded, to describe such visions as were presented to him, and he only asked in return that if the people and places were recognized, those who recognized them would be brave enough to say so, for the sake of the audience and himself. I can understand that strangers who went there and heard nothing that concerned themselves would be very apt to imagine it was all humbug, and that those who claimed a knowledge of the visions were simply confederates of Mr. Fletcher. But there is nothing more true than that circumstances alter cases. I entered Steinway Hall as a perfect stranger, and as a press writer, quite prepared to expose trickery if I detected it. And this is what I heard. After Mr. Fletcher had described several persons and scenes unknown to me, he took out a handkerchief and began to wipe his face, as though he were very warm.
I am no longer in England, now.
He said,
The scene has quite changed, and I am taken over the sea, thousands of miles away, and I am in a chamber with all the doors and windows open. Oh! How hot it is! I think I am somewhere in the tropics. Oh! I see why I have been brought here. It is to see a young man die. This is a death chamber. He is lying on a bed. He looks very pale, and he is very near death, but he has only been ill a short time. His hair is a kind of golden chestnut color, and he has blue eyes. He is an Englishman, and I can see the letter P above his head. He has not been happy on earth, and he is quite content to die. He pushes all the influences that are round his bed away from him. Now I see a lady come and sit down beside him. He holds her hand, and appears to ask her to do something, and I hear a strain of sweet music. It is a song he has heard in happier times, and on the breath of it his spirit passes away. It is to this lady he seems to come now. She is sitting on my left about halfway down the hall. A little girl, with her hands full of blue flowers, points her out to me. The little girl holds up the flowers, and I see they are woven into a resemblance of the letter F. She tells me that is the initial letter of her mother's name and her own. And I see this message written. To my dearest friend, for such you ever were to me from the beginning. I have been with you through all your time of trial and sorrow, and I am rejoiced to see that a happier era is beginning for you. I am always near you. The darkness is fast rolling away, and happiness will succeed it. Pray for me, and I shall be near you in your prayers. I pray God to bless you and to bless me, and to bring us together again in the summer land. And I see the Spirit pointing with his hand far away, as though to intimate that the happiness he speaks of is only the beginning of some that will extend to a long distance of time. I see this scene more plainly than any I have ever seen before.
These words were written down at the time they were spoken. Colonel Lean and I were sitting in the very spot indicated by Mr. Fletcher, and the little girl with the blue flowers was my spirit child, Florence, whose history I shall give in the next chapter. But my communications with John Powles, though very extraordinary, were not satisfactory to me. I am the Thomas, surnamed Didymus, of the spiritualistic world, who wants to see and touch and handle before I can altogether believe. I wanted to meet John Powles and talk with him face to face, and it seemed such an impossibility for him to materialize in the light that, after his 2 failures with Miss Showers, he refused to try. I was always worrying him to tell me if we should meet in the body before I left this world, and his answer was always, yes. But not just yet. I had no idea then that I should have to cross the Atlantic before I saw my dear old friend again. Chapter 8, My Spirit Child. The same year that John Powles died, 1860, I passed through the greatest trouble of my life. It is quite unnecessary to my narrative to relate what that trouble was, nor how it affected me, but I suffered terribly both in mind and body, and it was chiefly for this reason that the medical men advised my return to England, which I reached on the 14th of December, and on the 30th of the same month a daughter was born to me, who survived her birth for only 10 days. The child was born with a most peculiar blemish, which it is necessary for the purpose of my argument to describe. On the left side of the upper lip was a mark as though a semicircular piece of flesh had been cut out by a bullet mold, which exposed part of the gum. The swallow also had been submerged in the gullet, so that she had for the short period of her earthly existence to be fed by artificial means, and the jaw itself had been so twisted that could she have lived to cut her teeth, the double ones would have been in front. This blemish was considered to be of so remarkable a type that Dr. Frederick Butler of Winchester, who attended me, invited several other medical men, from Southampton and other places, to examine the infant with him, and they all agreed that a similar case had never come under their notice before. This is a very important factor in my narrative. I was closely catechized as to whether I had suffered any physical or mental shock that should account for the injury to my child, and it was decided that the trouble I had experienced was sufficient to produce it. The case, under feigned names, was fully reported in the Lancet as something quite out of the common way. My little child, who was baptized by the name of Florence, lingered until the 10th of January, 1861, and then passed quietly away, and when my first natural disappointment was over I ceased to think of her except as of something which might have been, but never would be again. In this world of misery, the loss of an infant is soon swallowed up in more active trouble. Still I never quite forgot my poor baby, perhaps because at that time she was happily the one dead lamb of my little flock. In recounting the events of my first séance with Mrs. Holmes, I have mentioned how a young girl much muffled up about the mouth and chin appeared, and intimated that she came for me, although I could not recognize her. I was so ignorant of the life beyond the grave at that period, that it never struck me that the baby who had left me at 10 days old had been growing since our separation, until she had reached the age of 10 years. I could not interpret Longfellow, whom I consider one of the sublimest spiritualists of the age, as I can now. Day after day we think what she is doing. In those bright realms of air. Year after year, her tender steps pursuing. Behold her grown more fair. Not as a child shall we again behold her. For when, with rapture wild, in our embraces we again enfold her, she will not be a child, but a fair maiden in her Father's mansion, clothed with celestial grace, and beautiful with all the soul's expansion. Shall we behold her face? The first séance made such an impression on my mind that 2 nights afterwards I again presented myself, this time alone, at Mrs. Holmes' rooms to attend another. It was a very different circle on the second occasion. There were about 30 people present, all strangers to each other, and the manifestations were proportionately ordinary. Another professional medium, a Mrs. Davenport, was present, as one of her controls, whom she called Belle, had promised, if possible, to show her face to her. As soon, therefore, as the first spirit face appeared, which was that of the same little girl that I had seen before, Mrs. Davenport exclaimed,
There's Belle.
"Why?" I said, "That's the little nun we saw on Monday."
Oh, no. That's my Belle,
persisted Mrs. Davenport. But Mrs. Holmes took my side, and was positive the spirit came for me. She told me she had been trying to communicate with her since the previous séance.
I know she is nearly connected with you,
she said.
Have you never lost a relation of her age?
Never, I replied, and at that declaration the little spirit moved away, sorrowfully as before. A few weeks after I received an invitation from Mr. Henry Dunphy, the gentleman who had introduced me to Mrs. Holmes, to attend a private séance, given at his own house in Upper Gloucester Place, by the well-known medium Florence Cook. The double drawing rooms were divided by velvet curtains, behind which Miss Cook was seated in an armchair, the curtains being pinned together halfway up, leaving a large aperture in the shape of a V. Being a complete stranger to Miss Cook, I was surprised to hear the voice of her control direct that I should stand by the curtains and hold the lower parts together whilst the forms appeared above, lest the pins should give way, and necessarily from my position I could hear every word that passed between Miss Cook and her guide. The first face that showed itself was that of a man unknown to me, then ensued a kind of frightened colloquy between the medium and her control.
Take it away. Go away. I don't like you. Don't touch me, you frighten me. Go away.
I heard Miss Cook exclaim, and then her guide's voice interposed itself.
Don't be silly, Florrie. Don't be unkind. It won't hurt you,
etc., and immediately afterwards the same little girl I had seen at Mrs. Holmes rose to view at the aperture of the curtains, muffled up as before, but smiling with her eyes at me. I directed the attention of the company to her, calling her again my little nun. I was surprised, however, at the evident distaste Miss Cook had displayed towards the spirit, and when the séance was concluded and she had regained her normal condition, I asked her if she could recall the faces she saw under trance.
Sometimes,
she replied. I told her of the little nun, and demanded the reason of her apparent dread of her.
I can hardly tell you,
said Miss Cook.
I don't know anything about her. She is quite a stranger to me, but her face is not fully developed, I think. There is something wrong about her mouth. She frightens me.
This remark, though made with the utmost carelessness, set me thinking, and after I had returned home, I wrote to Miss Cook, asking her to inquire of her guides who the little spirit was. She replied as follows.
Dear Mrs. Roschurch, I have asked Katie King, but she cannot tell me anything further about the spirit that came through me the other evening than that she is a young girl closely connected with yourself.
I was not, however, yet convinced of the spirit's identity, although John Powles constantly assured me that it was my child. I tried hard to communicate with her at home, but without success. I find in the memoranda I kept of our private séances at that period several messages from Powles referring to Florence. In one he says,
Your child's want of power to communicate with you is not because she is too pure, but because she is too weak. She will speak to you some day. She is not in heaven.
This last assertion, knowing so little as I did of a future state, both puzzled and grieved me. I could not believe that an innocent infant was not in the beatific presence, yet I could not understand what motive my friend could have in leading me astray. I had yet to learn that once received into heaven no spirit could return to earth, and that a spirit may have a training to undergo, even though it has never committed a mortal sin. A further proof, however, that my dead child had never died was to reach me from a quarter where I least expected it. I was editor of the magazine London Society at that time, and amongst my contributors was Dr. Kenningdale Cook, who had married Mabel Collins, the now well-known writer of spiritualistic novels. One day Dr. Cook brought me an invitation from his wife, whom I had never met, to spend Saturday to Monday with them in their cottage at Redhill, and I accepted it, knowing nothing of the proclivities of either of them, and they knowing as little of my private history as I did of theirs. And I must take this opportunity to observe that, at this period, I had never made my lost child the subject of conversation even with my most intimate friends. The memory of her life and death, and the troubles that caused it, was not a happy one, and of no interest to any but myself. So little, therefore, had it been discussed amongst us that until Florence reappeared to revive the topic, my elder children were ignorant that their sister had been marked in any way differently from themselves. It may, therefore, be supposed how unlikely it was that utter strangers and public media should have gained any inkling of the matter. I went down to Redhill, and as I was sitting with the Kenningdale Cooks after dinner, the subject of spiritualism came on the tapis, and I was informed that the wife was a powerful trance medium, which much interested me, as I had not, at that period, had any experience of her particular class of mediumship. In the evening we sat together, and Mrs. Cook having become entranced, her husband took shorthand notes of her utterances. Several old friends of their family spoke through her, and I was listening to them in the listless manner in which we hear the conversation of strangers, when my attention was aroused by the medium suddenly leaving her seat, and falling on her knees before me, kissing my hands and face, and sobbing violently the while. I waited in expectation of hearing who this might be, when the manifestations as suddenly ceased, the medium returned to her seat, and the voice of one of her guides said that the spirit was unable to speak through excessive emotion, but would try again later in the evening. I had almost forgotten the circumstance in listening to other communications, when I was startled by hearing the word mother, sighed rather than spoken. I was about to make some excited reply, when the medium raised her hand to enjoin silence, and the following communication was taken down by Mr. Cook as she pronounced the words. The sentences in parentheses are my replies to her.
Mother. I am Florence. I must be very quiet. I want to feel I have a mother still. I am so lonely. Why should I be so? I cannot speak well. I want to be like one of you. I want to feel I have a mother and sisters. I am so far away from you all now.
But I always think of you, my dear dead baby.
That's just it, your baby. But I'm not a baby now. I shall get nearer. They tell me I shall. I do not know if I can come when you are alone. It's all so dark. I know you are there, but so dimly. I've grown all by myself. I'm not really unhappy, but I want to get nearer you. I know you think of me, but you think of me as a baby. You don't know me as I am. You've seen me, because in my love I have forced myself upon you. I've not been amongst the flowers yet, but I shall be, very soon now. But I want my mother to take me there. All has been given me that can be given me, but I cannot receive it, except in so far.
Here she seemed unable to express herself. Did the trouble I had before your birth affect your spirit, Florence?
Only as things cause each other. I was with you, mother, all through that trouble. I should be nearer to you than any child you have, if I could only get close to you.
I can't bear to hear you speak so sadly, dear. I have always believed that you, at least, were happy in heaven.
I am not in heaven. But there will come a day, mother, I can laugh when I say it, when we shall go to heaven together and pick blue flowers, blue flowers. They are so good to me here, but if your eye cannot bear the daylight you cannot see the buttercups and daisies.
I did not learn till afterwards that in the spiritual language blue flowers are typical of happiness. The next question I asked her was if she thought she could write through me.
I don't seem able to write through you, but why, I know not.
Do you know your sisters, Eva and Ethel?
No, no.
In a weary voice.
The link of sisterhood is only through the mother. That kind of sisterhood does not last, because there is a higher.
Do you ever see your father?
No, he is far, far away. I went once, not more. Mother, dear, he'll love me when he comes here. They've told me so, and they always tell truth here. I am but a child, yet not so very little. I seem composed of two things, a child in ignorance and a woman in years. Why can't I speak at other places? I have wished and tried. I've come very near, but it seems so easy to speak now. This medium seems so different.
I wish you could come to me when I am alone, Florence.
You shall know me. I will come, mother, dear. I shall always be able to come here. I do come to you, but not in the same way.
She spoke in such a plaintive, melancholy voice that Mrs. Cook, thinking she would depress my spirits, said,
Don't make your state out to be sadder than it really is.
Her reply was very remarkable.
I am, as I am. Friend, when you come here, if you find that sadness is, you will not be able to alter it by plunging into material pleasures. Our sadness makes the world we live in. It is not deeds that make us wrong. It is the state in which we were born. Mother, you say I died sinless. That is nothing. I was born in a state. Had I lived, I should have caused you more pain than you can know. I am better here. I was not fit to battle with the world, and they took me from it. Mother, you won't let this make you sad. You must not.
What can I do to bring you nearer to me?
I don't know what will bring me nearer, but I'm helped already by just talking to you. There's a ladder of brightness, every step. I believe I've gained just one step now. Oh, the divine teachings are so mysterious. Mother, does it seem strange to you to hear your baby say things as if she knew them? I'm going now. Goodbye.
And so Florence went. The next voice that spoke was that of a guide of the medium, and I asked her for a personal description of my daughter as she then appeared. She replied,
Her face is downcast. We have tried to cheer her, but she is very sad. It is the state in which she was born. Every physical deformity is the mark of a condition. A weak body is not necessarily the mark of a weak spirit, but the prison of it, because the spirit might be too passionate otherwise. You cannot judge in what way the mind is deformed, because the body is deformed. It does not follow that a canker in the body is a canker in the mind. But the mind may be too exuberant, may need a canker to restrain it.
I have copied this conversation, word for word, from the shorthand notes taken at the time of utterance, and when it is remembered that neither Mrs. Kenningale Cook nor her husband knew that I had lost a child, that they had never been in my house nor associated with any of my friends, it will at least be acknowledged, even by the most skeptical, that it was a very remarkable coincidence that I should receive such a communication from the lips of a perfect stranger. Only once after this did Florence communicate with me through the same source. She found congenial media nearer home, and naturally availed herself of them. But the second occasion was almost more convincing than the first. I went one afternoon to consult my solicitor in the strictest confidence as to how I should act under some very painful circumstances, and he gave me his advice. The next morning as I sat at breakfast, Mrs. Cook, who was still living at Redhill, ran into my room with an apology for the unceremoniousness of her visit, on the score that she had received a message for me the night before which Florence had begged her to deliver without delay. The message was to this effect.
Tell my mother that I was with her this afternoon at the lawyer's, and she is not to follow the advice given her, as it will do harm instead of good.
Mrs. Cook added,
I don't know to what Florence alludes, of course, but I thought it best, as I was coming to town, to let you know at once.
The force of this anecdote does not lie in the context. The mystery is contained in the fact of a secret interview having been overheard and commented upon. But the truth is, that having greater confidence in the counsel of my visible guide than in that of my invisible one, I abided by the former, and regretted it ever afterwards. The first conversation I held with Florence had a great effect upon me. I knew before that my uncontrolled grief had been the cause of the untimely death of her body, but it had never struck me that her spirit would carry the effects of it into the unseen world. It was a warning to me, as it should be to all mothers, not to take the solemn responsibility of maternity upon themselves without being prepared to sacrifice their own feelings for the sake of their children. Florence assured me, however, that communion with myself in my improved condition of happiness would soon lift her spirit from its state of depression, and consequently I seized every opportunity of seeing and speaking with her. During the succeeding 12 months I attended numerous séances with various media, and my spirit child, as she called herself, never failed to manifest through the influence of any one of them, though, of course, in different ways. Through some she touched me only, and always with an infant's hand, that I might recognize it as hers, or laid her mouth against mine that I might feel the scar upon her lip. Through others she spoke, or wrote, or showed her face, but I never attended a séance at which she omitted to notify her presence. Once at a dark circle, held with Mr. Charles Williams, after having had my dress and that of my next neighbour, Lady Archibald Campbell, pulled several times as if to attract our attention, the darkness opened before us, and there stood my child, smiling at us like a happy dream, her fair hair waving about her temples, and her blue eyes fixed on me. She was clothed in white, but we saw no more than her head and bust, about which her hands held her drapery. Lady Archibald Campbell saw her as plainly as I did. On another occasion Mr. William Eglinton proposed to me to try and procure the spirit writing on his arm. He directed me to go into another room and write the name of the friend I loved best in the spirit world upon a scrap of paper, which I was to twist up tightly and take back to him. I did so, writing the name of John Powles. When I returned to Mr. Eglinton, he bared his arm, and holding the paper to the candle till it was reduced to tinder, rubbed his flesh with the ashes. I knew what was expected to ensue. The name written on the paper was to reappear in red or white letters on the medium's arm. The skeptic would say it was a trick of thought reading, and that, the medium knowing what I had written, had prepared the writing during my absence. But to his surprise and mine, when at last he shook the ashes from his arm, we read, written in a bold, clear hand, the words, "Florence is the dearest," as though my spirit child had given me a gentle rebuke for writing any name but her own. It seems curious to me now to look back and remember how melancholy she used to be when she first came back to me, for as soon as she had established an unbroken communication between us, she developed into the merriest little spirit I have ever known, and though her childhood has now passed away, and she is more dignified and thoughtful and womanly, she always appears joyous and happy. She has manifested largely to me through the mediumship of Mr. Arthur Coleman. I had known her, during a dark séance with a very small private circle, the medium being securely held and fastened the while, run about the room, like the child she was, and speak to and kiss each sitter in turn, pulling off the sofa and chair covers and piling them up in the middle of the table. And changing the ornaments of everyone present, placing the gentlemen's neckties round the throats of the ladies, and hanging the ladies' earrings in the buttonholes of the gentlemen's coats, just as she might have done had she been still with us, a happy, petted child, on earth. I have known her come in the dark and sit on my lap and kiss my face and hands, and let me feel the defect in her mouth with my own. One bright evening on the 9th of July, my birthday, Arthur Coleman walked in quite unexpectedly to pay me a visit, and as I had some friends with me, we agreed to have a séance. It was impossible to make the room dark, as the windows were only shaded by Venetian blinds, but we lowered them, and sat in the twilight. The first thing we heard was the voice of Florence whispering,
"A present for dear mother's birthday,"
when something was put into my hand. Then she crossed to the side of a lady present and dropped something into her hand, saying,
"And a present for dear mother's friend."
I knew at once by the feel of it that what Florence had given me was a chaplet of beads, and knowing how often, under similar circumstances, articles are merely carried about a room, I concluded it was one which lay upon my drawing-room mantelpiece, and said as much. I was answered by the voice of Amy, the medium's nearest control.
"You are mistaken,"
she said.
"Florence has given you a chaplet you have never seen before. She was exceedingly anxious to give you a present on your birthday, so I gave her the beads which were buried with me. They came from my coffin. I held them in my hand. All I ask is, that you will not show them to Arthur until I give you leave. He is not well at present, and the sight of them will upset him."
I was greatly astonished, but, of course, I followed her instructions, and when I had an opportunity to examine the beads, I found that they really were strangers to me, and had not been in the house before. The present my lady friend had received was a large, unset topaz. The chaplet was made of carved wood and steel. It was not till months had elapsed that I was given permission to show it to Arthur Coleman. He immediately recognized it as the one he had himself placed in the hands of Amy as she lay in her coffin, and when I saw how the sight affected him, I regretted I had told him anything about it. I offered to give the beads up to him, but he refused to receive them, and they remain in my possession to this day. But the great climax that was to prove beyond all question the personal identity of the spirit who communicated with me, with the body I had brought into the world, was yet to come. Mr. William Harrison, the editor of The Spiritualist, who, after 17 years' patient research into the science of spiritualism, had never received a personal proof of the return of his own friends, or relations, wrote me word that he had received a message from his lately deceased friend, Mrs. Stewart, to the effect that if he would sit with the medium, Florence Cook, and one or two harmonious companions, she would do her best to appear to him in her earthly likeness and afford him the test he had so long sought after. Mr. Harrison asked me, therefore, if I would join him and Miss Kidlingberry, the secretary to the British National Association of Spiritualists, in holding a séance with Miss Cook, to which I agreed, and we met in one of the rooms of the association for that purpose. It was a very small room, about 8 feet by 16 feet, was uncarpeted and contained no furniture, so we carried in 3 cane-bottomed chairs for our accommodation. Across one corner of the room, about 4 feet from the floor, we nailed an old black shawl, and placed a cushion behind it for Miss Cook to lean her head against. Miss Florence Cook, who is a brunette, of a small, slight figure, with dark eyes and hair which she wore in a profusion of curls, was dressed in a high grey merino, ornamented with crimson ribbons. She informed me previous to sitting, that she had become restless during her trances lately, and in the habit of walking out amongst the circle, and she asked me as a friend, for such we had by that time become, to scold her well should such a thing occur, and order her to go back into the cabinet as if she were a child or a dog, and I promised her I would do so. After Florence Cook had sat down on the floor, behind the black shawl, which left her grey merino skirt exposed, and laid her head against the cushion, we lowered the gas a little, and took our seats on the 3 cane chairs. The medium appeared very uneasy at first, and we heard her remonstrating with the influences for using her so roughly. In a few minutes, however, there was a tremulous movement of the black shawl, and a large white hand was several times thrust into view and withdrawn again. I had never seen Mrs. Stewart, for whom we were expressly sitting, in this life, and could not, therefore, recognize the hand, but we all remarked how large and white it was. In another minute the shawl was lifted up, and a female figure crawled on its hands and knees from behind it, and then stood up and regarded us. It was impossible, in the dim light and at the distance she stood from us, to identify the features, so Mr. Harrison asked if she were Mrs. Stewart. The figure shook its head. I had lost a sister a few months previously, and the thought flashed across me that it might be her. "Is it you, Emily?" I asked, but the head was still shaken to express a negative, and a similar question on the part of Miss Kidlingberry, with respect to a friend of her own, met with the same response. "Who can it be?" I remarked curiously to Mr. Harrison.
Mother, don't you know me?
Sounded in Florence's whispering voice. I started up to approach her, exclaiming, "Oh, my darling child. I never thought I should meet you here." But she said,
Go back to your chair, and I will come to you.
I reseated myself, and Florence crossed the room and sat down on my lap. She was more unclothed on that occasion than any materialized spirit I have ever seen. She wore nothing on her head, only her hair, of which she appears to have an immense quantity, fell down her back and covered her shoulders. Her arms were bare and her feet and part of her legs, and the dress she wore had no shape or style, but seemed like so many yards of soft thick muslin, wound round her body from the bosom to below the knees. She was a heavyweight, perhaps 10 stone, and had well-covered limbs. In fact, she was then, and has appeared for several years past, to be, in point of size and shape, so like her eldest sister Eva, that I always observed the resemblance between them. This séance took place at a period when Florence must have been about 17 years old. "Florence, my darling," I said, "is this really you?"
Turn up the gas,
She answered.
and look at my mouth.
Mr. Harrison did as she desired, and we all saw distinctly that peculiar defect on the lip with which she was born, a defect, be it remembered, which some of the most experienced members of the profession had affirmed to be so rare as never to have fallen under their notice before. She also opened her mouth that we might see she had no gullet. I promised at the commencement of my book to confine myself to facts, and leave the deduction to be drawn from them to my readers, so I will not interrupt my narrative to make any remarks upon this incontrovertible proof of identity. I know it struck me dumb, and melted me into tears. At this juncture Miss Cook, who had been moaning and moving about a good deal behind the black shawl, suddenly exclaimed,
I can't stand this any longer.
And walked out into the room. There she stood in her grey dress and crimson ribbons whilst Florence sat on my lap in white drapery. But only for a moment, for directly the medium was fully in view, the spirit sprung up and darted behind the curtain. Recalling Miss Cook's injunctions to me, I scolded her heartily for leaving her seat, until she crept back, whimpering, to her former position. The shawl had scarcely closed behind her before Florence reappeared and clung to me, saying,
Don't let her do that again. She frightens me so.
She was actually trembling all over. Why, Florence, I replied. Do you mean to tell me you are frightened of your medium? In this world it is we poor mortals who are frightened of the spirits.
I am afraid she will send me away, mother,
she whispered. However, Miss Cook did not disturb us again, and Florence stayed with us for some time longer. She clasped her arms round my neck, and laid her head upon my bosom, and kissed me dozens of times. She took my hand and spread it out, and said she felt sure I should recognize her hand when she thrust it outside the curtain, because it was so much like my own. I was suffering much trouble at that time, and Florence told me the reason God had permitted her to show herself to me in her earthly deformity was so that I might be sure that she was herself, and that spiritualism was a truth to comfort me.
Sometimes you doubt, mother,
she said,
and think your eyes and ears have misled you. But after this you must never doubt again. Don't fancy I am like this in the spirit land. The blemish left me long ago. But I put it on tonight to make you certain. Don't fret, dear mother. Remember, I am always near you. No one can take me away. Your earthly children may grow up and go out into the world and leave you, but you will always have your spirit child close to you.
I did not, and cannot, calculate for how long Florence remained visible on that occasion. Mr. Harrison told me afterwards that she had remained for nearly 20 minutes. But her undoubted presence was such a stupendous fact to me, that I could only think that she was there, that I actually held in my arms the tiny infant I had laid with my own hands in her coffin, that she was no more dead than I was myself, but had grown to be a woman. So I sat, with my arms tight round her, and my heart beating against hers, until the power decreased, and Florence was compelled to give me a last kiss and leave me stupefied and bewildered by what had so unexpectedly occurred. 2 other spirits materialized and appeared after she had left us, but as neither of them was Mrs. Stewart, the séance, as far as Mr. Harrison was concerned, was a failure. I have seen and heard Florence on numerous occasions since the one I have narrated, but not with the mark upon her mouth, which she assures me will never trouble either of us again. I could fill pages with accounts of her pretty, caressing ways, and her affectionate and sometimes solemn messages, but I have told as much of her story as will interest the general reader. It has been wonderful to me to mark how her ways and mode of communication have changed with the passing years. It was a simple child who did not know how to express itself that appeared to me in 1873. It is a woman full of counsel and tender warning that comes to me in 1890. But yet she is only 19. When she reached that age, Florence told me she should never grow any older in years or appearance, and that she had reached the climax of womanly perfection in the spirit world. Only tonight, the night before Christmas Day, as I write her story, she comes to me and says,
Mother, you must not give way to sad thoughts. The past is past. Let it be buried in the blessings that remain to you.
And amongst the greatest of those blessings I reckon my belief in the existence of my spirit child.